Hi, I'm Amber Schrader, Executive Director of Badgers United, and you are listening to The Flagship. Today we are joined by State Senator Janet Bewley, who represents the 25th District. She serves on both the Committee on Education and the Committee on Universities, Technical College, Children, and Families in the State Senate. We are looking forward to hearing her perspective on the state of higher education in Wisconsin. Thank you for joining us today, Senator.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we dive into the content of our conversation, I want to give our listeners an idea of who you are and where you're from. So could you tell us a little bit about your district?
Well, it's the 25th Senate District, which is about as far north as you can go. And I really mean north. The 25th is the largest district in the state, and it, beginning with, borders Lake Superior all the way from Michigan to Minnesota. And it goes down south as far as Rice Lake, Clear Lake, Turtle Lake, all those little lake towns. So it's a giant district and extremely diverse.
So one of the sort of crown jewels of your little district, not little, your big district, I'm so sorry, is that Lake Superior, Big Top, Chautauqua, you were a founding cast member of this.
I was, and it was a really interesting introduction to northern Wisconsin. At the same time, a familiarity with music. I moved here in 77. In 78 and 79, I met the person who was going to be my husband and father of the kids, and he was a musician from Madison. So he came up hanging out with me in Ashland. Then along came some more musicians and some more musicians. They formed a band called Lost Nation String Band, which had their origin here in Madison at Potts Bar. And they eventually formed Lake Superior, Big Top, Chautauqua, and it has evolved over time from kind of a local, musician thing to a major act show, but all under a tent.
And a major economic generator for your area.
Absolutely. The economic impact has been measured, but we just know it by the fact that we see the cars, we see the dollar signs in our local shops and places, lodging establishment. It's just a good thing all the way around.
Very interesting. So one of the many jobs you've held was the Dean of Students at Northland College. How does this role shape your views when you're in the Capitol?
Well, higher education has always been extremely important to me. I was the first person in my family to go to college, where I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. In my neighborhood, you generally didn't go to college. If you were female, you either got a job or you got married, and very few of my classmates went on to college. And none of the people in my family did, but I always knew I wanted to. So I was lucky enough to be able to go to a local university, Case Western Reserve, and then I went to Maine for graduate school, and then I came to northern Wisconsin. And I instantly became familiar with both the private colleges, because that's who hired me, Northland College in Ashland, and the University of Wisconsin system, because there was the University of Wisconsin in Superior, very close by. And it made me aware of the fact that so many kids aspire to higher education, and they take different paths to get there. Some may do it right after they graduate. Others may have to wait. Some may go to private. Some may go to public. And some may not go at all because they simply can't afford it.
That's really interesting. So that leads us into a conversation that our group has been having around the ongoing tuition freeze. We recently were at a hearing. You were there for Senate Bill 343, which says that when and if tuition is thought, it would be tied to CPI to give families and the universities predictability. And we're curious to hear what your thoughts are on that sort of approach.
Well, I think it's a good approach. I think that, first of all, we have to figure out a way to make sure that our schools are funded, the universities funded in a way where we didn't have to start getting involved in controlling the cost of it, because one of the things is that a public university should have public support. And if you look at just the undergraduate system in our state, the portion of it that really gets state aid is surprisingly small. Some measure it at 20%, some say 21%, some campuses are as low as 17%. Once you focus in revenue for graduate school or the medical colleges or those and research contracts, it looks like there's less of a burden. But in fact, the state of Wisconsin is not funding the university system in a way that I believe makes it public, in quotes. And I think that if we started to get the kind of aid that a university system deserves, we wouldn't have to keep talking about these caps on tuition. We'd be able to bring the tuition down simply because we had the appropriate revenue from state aid, which we don't have. So I guess that's a way of saying I wish we didn't have to talk about tuition freeze, but I know it is an issue for students. But I also know that students are very aware that when the tuition is frozen, so many other things are frozen, like what salary faculty members get, or the variety of classes and the frequency of required classes. So sometimes you might have a tuition freeze, but it takes you 5 years to graduate. So where's the savings there?
Right. You bring up an interesting point when we talk about faculty pay. One thing we hear often when we're talking with citizens is this sort of misconception about how we should be paying faculty. How do you talk to your constituents about the need to pay faculty appropriately?
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind that this is a competitive business. We have very high ideals for what our faculty should be capable of doing and the kind of content and skill that they can deliver to students. And I think that if we dummy down the rate of pay that we give them, the highest and best faculty members are going to go elsewhere. If we are ranking in terms of how public universities pay faculty across the country, if we can't compete, we aren't going to have the University of Wisconsin system with the kind of reputation that it has now and deserves to continue to have. So you can't pay an A-plus faculty B-minus wages. You just can't. And I think the one thing that we're very, very proud of is that we do have an A-plus faculty, and we want to keep them, and we want to recruit more.
I think one thing when people are talking about faculty and they hear A-plus faculty, they fall back on this narrative that's, easy to find on social media, that faculty aren't in the classroom and they should be teaching more and they've lost sight of what their jobs are. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think sometimes they look at averages and they look at a faculty member or the average faculty member. And I think that, number one, you have to separate out undergraduate. And you have to look at those faculty members who focus primarily on undergraduate education. If you have a research scientist who is on a research contract and also teaches, he or she is going to spend less time in the classroom than they do in the laboratory. And can you put value on that? Can you say, well, they're not teaching enough because, oh my God, they're trying to find a cure for cancer at the same time? I think that we have to make sure we're talking about the teaching faculty that they expect are going to be in the classroom all the time, and that's undergraduate classes. And I really would be very happy to continue to defend the hard work that our faculty members contribute, whether it's in the classroom, whether it is advising students and graduate students, or whether they're in a lab doing research.
So I think the research piece is what's misunderstood. I don't think folks, I can only speak to UW-Madison data here, but I don't think folks understand the amount of money that comes into our state because of the research faculty that we have in our state, and that every county in our state has vendors that come from UW-Madison dollars.
That's right. I mean, it is a complex entity. It gains revenue in many ways, and it purchases a lot of goods from the state. And of course, there is preference for in-state vendors. And we've got to realize that if you take any one metric out of all of the metrics that the university would generate, you have to compare them or put them in context with other things. Like you can't compare Whitewater to Green Bay to Platteville to Stevens Point. They're all very, very different because they operate on their own and work on their own. But here's the interesting thing. There's only one Board of Regents. So they're supposed to serve a very unique population and area, but they don't have their own boards. They all are under one Board of Regents.
That is an interesting perspective that I think people aren't thinking about. I think often that folks are trying to compare Madison to Milwaukee or Green Bay, and it's just not a fair comparison. It's two totally different things and missions and outcomes.
Absolutely. I mean, you look at the natural resources emphasis at Stevens Point, and then you look at other campuses who specialize in another area. River Falls is engineering and ag. That's where people go. And I think that that's very important that they reflect both a unique mission and the area where they're located. And the other thing I know that people are very aware of the fact that in their own communities they have school boards. So their school district is governed by a local school board. They have technical college systems, which are governed by a local technical college board. I think it would be very simple to assume that the local university is going to have a local board, either in Superior or wherever that college or that university happens to be. But that's not the case. They don't have their own board. One board of regents covering all campuses.
So are you suggesting that we should reconsider how we govern these institutions?
Not necessarily, but I think if we're going to leave it this way, then we've got to make sure that the Board of Regents recognizes that they need to have a little more autonomy and either give them autonomy or recognize how different they are. And you can't expect everyone to follow the same metrics. It might literally cost more for 1 hour of classroom time in Madison than it does at Platteville. It may do that. And I think that there's usually an expectation on the part of either the Board of Regents or any governing organization that the simplicity and the constancy of data, it should be the same. That makes it simple, but that doesn't make it fair.
Mm-hmm. You said something really interesting, sort of related to this in the hearing that we were at. You said, UW-Madison, 14% of their budget comes from state dollars, mm-hmm. and you said 14% of the budget shouldn't control 100% of the decisions.
Exactly. Well, again, public universities come out of a tradition of, land grants was one, but generally the belief that we were going to use public dollars, in this case state dollars, to subsidize, to fill in very large gaps of revenue when you're dealing with a population of people who want access to an affordable public university, much like they have access to a free public K-12. And we've gotten away from that. We have gotten into the feeling that, no, the universities should depend much more on tuition dollars, and they should be able to generate the revenue they need and pull back from the amount of state aid they get. And at the same time, the state is saying, but we're going to cap your revenue. So they're going to take revenue away on both ends. They're going to cut the amount of aid that the state gives you, and then they're going to tell you, and you can't charge more revenue on tuition. So where do they think the money's going to come from? Well, they think you cut. And we've cut enough. There's no more room for cutting. We have to admit that we are a public university that should be funded by a greater percentage of public dollars, meaning direct, it's called GPR, general purpose revenue, that would go to the universities.
So I think this is a trend that we're seeing nationwide, this sort of cut to higher public education, and with competing priorities, healthcare being one of the biggest ones. How does the university system compete for dollars? How can they effectively go to the state and say, we need more? What's the argument they should be making?
Well, I think that, I'm going to back up a long way and say our university system today is what apparently the voters believe is going in the direction they want. So the most important thing to remember is that if it's a public university, it has a lot of participation by the legislature. So when you vote, when you go to the ballot box and vote for your state senator or your state representative, find out what their attitude is about the university system. And let them know what you believe, because right now I don't know if people really make that connection. My vote affects the policy at the University of Wisconsin, mm-hmm. because it does.
Right. When I first took this job back in October of last year.
Seems like ages.
Yeah, it's been a little over a year. Mm-hmm. But a Marquette poll came out and it said 2% of the population looks at UW system as a reason that they vote for somebody. Mm-hmm. How do we change that?
Well, I think that it's overall an education process that people have to realize when you vote, you are voting for more than a smiling face. You are making policy choices yourself when you vote for someone. And in order to know what those policy choices are that you just voted for, you have to find out what they're really saying. And they cannot simply say ideological things like, make America green again or something. I don't know. You can't just do that. You have to say what it is you're going to do as a candidate and why and where are your priorities. If you are campaigning, you have the responsibility to say, I am going to fight for higher education, or I am going to fight for K-12, or I'm going to fight for local transportation dollars. And people have to listen for those things and then say, oh, okay, and are you going to fight for Medicaid expansion? You have a right to ask those questions, get those answers, and use that information to make an educated vote.
That's really, really good feedback, I think, for folks. We're in a world right now where we have split government. We have a Democratic governor, Republican legislature. Do you think there's any opportunity for folks to come together to help the system, UW system?
I have to believe that there is. I have to believe that there's always hope because that's the nature of my job, is to believe in tomorrow. And I do. And I believe in tomorrow because I believe in the people that I represent. So I know that people are tired of the noise and they're tired of the divisiveness. And I also know that I can't assume that the people, we describe them across the aisle, believe what the common knowledge is of how a Democrat or a Republican believe. I have to give them the benefit of the doubt and sit across from the table and start from the beginning. How do you feel about education? How do you feel about healthcare in your district? Tell me how you feel, representative or senator. And if you start from there and don't start with the assumptions, don't start with a national party slogan, go to the heartbeat of the person you're talking to. And it's hard. It's hard to say, I'm going to forget everything you've ever done. I'm going to forget every bad vote you've ever taken. I'm going to forget, pardon me, every stupid thing you've ever said, which they could say the same to me. They could say the same to me. Start from the beginning. And I do have hope. I have faith in that.
Where do you think there's most potential for movement?
I think in some of the very basic things. I think that I always say I want to talk to people and fix the things that keep them awake at night. And when you ask people that, it's always about how are my kids going to be? And are they going to get the education they deserve? Are they going to be okay in 20 years? Meaning, are we going to have an economy? Are we going to have health care? Is my child eventually going to commit suicide? Do I have a community that can hold me and my family up, either in times of need or in giving me quality of life? Can my state and my community do that? And when you ask them, yeah, I think they will, they're going to say, how? What are you going to do? And I'm going to say, what do you want? What do you need? And one of the most interesting things I heard was, it was really simple. I want to give my kid the shoes that he wants and not the shoes that he needs. He's never had the shoes he's always wanted. And I know what that feels like, to be a kid, and I wanted a puffy coat. I don't know if you remember those puffy coats. When I was little, they were pink and they had white fur.
Oh, sure, yeah.
I never had one. Never. I always got something that was made out of green wool, and it was always too big when I got it because it had to get passed down. Parents want to know that they are doing everything they can for their kids. And when they know they're doing the best they can and it's not enough, there's this state of desperation and almost trauma in that. I believe that no matter what side of the aisle you're on, you don't want parents to feel that way. You don't want anybody in your district to feel that way. I believe we can start from there and say, how can we build a Wisconsin that is going to allow them to live the life that they deserve?
So when you take that context and you look at the tuition freeze at the university system, Wisconsin system rather, how do we mush those two things together? How do we tell apparent that this freeze, it cannot last for forever. How do you do that?
Well, I think that I'm not trying to divert from the important conversation about the university, but I think it's important that we give every family all of the options that they have. And there are 2-year campuses that they can go to. In my district, that would be the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire at Barron County. We call it UCECBC. Mm-hmm. Or UEBCD, whatever. It's just an alphabet. Yep. And you can get 2 years under your belt, and it will all transfer to another 4-year campus. So that's an alternative. They have the right to explore every penny of financial aid that's available to them. And they don't know, and I'm a big fan of the university, don't get me wrong. There are private colleges, the liberal arts colleges of our state, who give enormous amounts of financial aid in grants, not loans. Mm-hmm. Explore those. Go to those and see what kind of because all of the institutions of higher education in our state want the same thing. They want all of the kids to have access to the education that they want and that they deserve. It might be a private school. It might be a university. Right now, I'm most concerned about the university because I don't think it's getting the money that it deserves from the state. But I know that this is all a giant partnership of really well-meaning people, including both sides of the aisle, the parents, and all of the administrators and faculty members. We all want the same thing. We just have to sit down at the table and find those answers.
So that conversation leads me to sort of thinking about this narrative that exists around student debt. It's at the national level. It's certainly at the state level. The governor just announced a task force to dig into this issue. It's our belief at Badgers United that there needs to be more granularity in this conversation and that not all universities are created equal when it comes to student debt generation. Mm-hmm. UW-Madison offers Bucky's Tuition Promise, so families that make less than $60,000 get 4 years of free tuition. 53% of students are graduating with zero debt. Those that do have less than $30,000 worth of debt. So I'm curious to hear your take on where you think this task force should look as they're considering this issue.
Well, I think that they have to make sure that they look far beyond just the University of Wisconsin system and far beyond just Madison and really look at what does student debt look like. Find out the information across our state. If somebody says, I'm being buried by student debt, let's ask them where that debt came from. Where did you go? I talked to a young woman who went to 2 years of beauty college of some sort. I don't know what it was, but she ended up with $9,000 of debt and no certificate. And to me, that's borderline predatory. And that was not a University of Wisconsin system. And I don't want to blame all the kind of training opportunities that you have, but let's keep going with that. Okay, you say you've got $40,000 of debt. Where did that come from? Well, I got sick and I couldn't go for 1 year, so I had to borrow money to live, and I used it all, and on and on. And it's like, well, why? How did you get in that situation? How can we prevent you? So I think basically we have to, number one, know what this debt looks like so we can pull it apart and find out how they got in that situation. And then we have to do something to prevent people from taking on debt that they're not going to be able to pay back. Just like anything else, in most cases, you have to prove your ability to pay something back before you get the loan, not with student financial aid. You don't have to prove anything. All you have to do is sign, and you are saying, I will pay this back. It's not collateralized. It has no ability for you to truly understand the effect that it's going to have on you when you're 25 or 26, and you're signing it sometimes when you're 17. And look at the credit card debt you can get into when you're 17. I remember going through orientation, and there were like 6 different credit card companies all lined up saying, here's $1,000 worth of credit. Just take the card. Somebody could end up being $5,000 in debt in a day. We've got to put all of this together. Now, I'm not trying to fudge the things that we might be able to do to help students today get out of debt. We have to do that. We have to look at alternatives. But we also have to remember all of the people who are working very, very hard and have for 10, 15 years and have paid back their debt. It wouldn't be fair to them if we had some sort of a bailout. A restructuring, absolutely. An ability to refinance certain kinds of loans, absolutely. But if you have already refinanced or done something else and it isn't like a public loan, it isn't something that we can just figure out how we can restructure it, you may already be in a situation where it's nothing that the state can fix. You're in a private sector loan that we can't get you out of. So
all of this is really exciting to me because we spend all this time looking at the data around student debt, and I just feel there's such a lack of granularity. So to hear you talk like this is pretty exciting. We also feel like perhaps the student debt issue is less about the accumulation of debt because you're offset by your earnings and more about how the debt is managed afterwards. Like you say, you take out a credit card or a mortgage, and if things go awry in your life, you have outs. You can get out of them. And that's not the case with student debt right now.
No, you can't. I mean, you agree to pay things off, and you really aren't thinking about, so how much money will I have to make a year to make these payments? You who's thinking about that when there's going to be a party at the dorm tonight? You're not thinking about what's going to happen in when I'm 26 or what your circumstances might be, or maybe you'll have to take off a year and go home because mom got sick. You don't know those things, and I think it's irresponsible of us to let students know when they're freshmen that this is free money. You don't have to worry about this for, that's irresponsible.
I totally agree with that. So, one of the things you talked about earlier is where you're from in the state, the very north. Why should folks in your district care about UW-Madison?
Well, let's talk about right today. In the University of Wisconsin Hospital, they admitted and diagnosed their first case of my husband calls it corona. I said it's not corona. It's not, what is it called?
I can't blame him. I conjure up the bottle to coronavirus.
Coronavirus. And that's the University of Wisconsin. The University of Wisconsin did that. And if you are in Superior, I can bet you that they are going to make sure that they have the diagnostic testing kits in Superior and all across the state. And if you have a concern about you, being in Wisconsin is one heck of a good place to be. Why? Because of the University of Wisconsin system. And it's not just with that. It is with the University of Wisconsin Veterinary Health. So the dairy industry in Barron, we have a veterinary testing lab in the city of Barron. That facility is responsible for identifying and responding to more bovine and bird type diseases. It is astonishing what they can do. They even take on some of the workload from Madison up in Barron. I mean,
Well, and a dog just got us our first Super Bowl ad, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, I mean, what we are capable of doing seems sometimes to be kind of weird, but it will always circle back and come home to us someday. And you're going to go, oh my God, that's right. They discovered that or patented that, and it helps me out. And not only that, there are so many things that you can access from Madison or from another school, and it's all shared. I mean, it's not like you are in a completely walled campus. The ability to transfer, the ability to take advantage of a foreign study program that perhaps came out of Stevens Point, but Whitewater students can go to. I mean, that is all over. It is the remarkable thing about the university, and perhaps that's one of the things that makes it good, that they are also blended in a way, but at the same time very different, is that if it's not found at your campus, you can probably transfer for a year and get it somewhere else. And, of course, also now the connectivity that we have with coursework done online. It's a game changer, totally. When are we going to stop saying game changer? Kind of come up with a new word. Anyway, it is so significant that it offers up course opportunities of the entire system. And these are changes that make every campus an integral part of the whole system. And so I think, it's not a matter of why should I be worried about, but oh my God, I gained so much by the fact that that campus is there.
It's great to sit across from you and hear you be such a cheerleader for the system. As they search for their new president with Ray Cross retiring, what do you think the Board of Regents should be looking for in this person?
Well, right now the Board of Regents is a bit of a representation of the past 10 years more than it is going forward, because I would think all but 3 have been appointed by the earlier administration. Governor Evers is going to be making 3 new appointments. So the first thing I would hope is that we could have some avenue to the regents to let them know what we think the University of Wisconsin should look like. And I believe that we want the university to look forward and to look at the future in a way that they don't feel constrained by the fears of the past, that they are creative and not so, what's the word I want to use? They seem to want to threaten the campuses rather than enhance their futures. And I think that we need to watch what the regents do. We need to find out as much as we can. And I mean, the regents are published who they are. Now, certainly we don't want to go writing them critical things, but, I think it's important that we stay. I think that this is one of the positions that we have the least access to when it comes to who's going to be chosen and who's in the room to make that decision. But I think that's one of the things that we need to break that down. If this is a public institution, the public should have access in some legitimate way and not just wait to be told who the regents selected.
We've had a couple of your colleagues from the legislature on this podcast in the past, and one word they use when they describe who the type of qualities that we should look for in our next system president is, they almost to a T said, change maker. What are your thoughts on that?
It depends on what they want to change and which way they want to change it. People can use all kinds of words, and change could be great if it's motivated by the right things. And if the change is, I want to take away its power and make the legislature govern everything it does, nope, that's not the kind of change I want. If it's the kind of change that says, I want to take a bold look at what a university structure in a state like Wisconsin should be, I would say go for it. Go for it. We can't be constrained by the structure that we have today. We have to be willing to look at new structures. And one of them that has always been kind of dangled out there that everybody just either fears or fawns over is community college system. They have that in Minnesota. They don't have, a technical college and a 2-year, it's one institution, and they have merged it in such a way where people aren't afraid that their territories are going to be undermined by some other kind of approach. And I'm willing to look at anything. I think that we have to imagine new structures and not be constrained by the ones that I think are a little antiquated.
I think you'll find you're in line with some of your colleagues that have been here before.
Very good.
So one last question. There's a lot of conversations happening in the Capitol right now about the unexpected surplus. What are your thoughts on that surplus? How should it be used? Should it be used?
Well, that is a question. How to use it and should it be used? I'm not an economist, but, people tell me economics 101, don't spend money you don't have or won't have next year if you put it into operating. So if you put the money into something that you can spend now and be okay that it's not there next time, then by all means we should consider that. But if we're thinking about using it to hire people, that's unfair. That's just simply unfair, because then you're setting people up to have to beg for it in the next budget, because it's a one-time thing, and say, okay, now try to get it again. And so what do? Get rid of all those people that you hired, all these, they're talking about community service officers in the schools so that they would have, some sort of police presence in schools. well, sure, hire them now, and then the money runs out and you don't have it in the next budget. The other thing is that we do need to, kind of bolster our reserves a little bit. And I think that if there is something that we should do with the money or some of it, it should go into crisis situations so that we can use it as if it is one-time cash. For example, we have some extremely dangerous bridges in our state, and they're being used. And I know that they're considered safe, but some of these are way out in the country, and they don't get inspected as often as they should. And people who shouldn't be using them are using them. Fix them. Just fix the suckers. And I just want them to be safe. There are some circumstances where we need to throw some good, solid revenue into certain little building projects here and there. I know of a community that has medical staff to put in a crisis bed situation. They have the building, and they even have the person who would staff it, but they need a certain amount of cash to just finish it, and they don't have it. I think we've got these kinds of things all over that we could do, these one-time infusions where people have been waiting for so long, and fund them. And if we get it again, so if we have a surplus again, well, then we can do it again. But we've got to build a budget on what we expect to get, and we can't spend one-time money as if we're going to get it forever, because that just sets people up.
I agree with you, actually. Totally agree with you. So we have been all over the place today. Before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to say?
Well, I guess I'd like to say that I consider serving in office as an immense privilege. This is something that came in my life when I didn't expect that I'd have this wonderful career that I started in my 50s. But the one thing I know is that the one thing that can make me better at what I do is hearing from the people that I represent and the people that are affected by the decisions that I make as a senator. So I encourage anyone to get in touch with me, and I also encourage anyone to please get in touch with the people that represent you. It is one of the most important things you can do, that and voting. That really does make government better, because, in fact, government is just us. It's just us.
That is great advice to end with. Thank you so much for being here today, Senator.
My pleasure.
This has been an episode of Badgers United Podcast, the flagship, where we work with thought leaders in higher education to make sense of the complex policy web that governs our state's largest university. Please follow us on Twitter at Badgers_United, sign up for our mailing list on our website, badgersunited.org, and subscribe to the flagship wherever you get your podcasts.